Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to Donor Egg IVF, Where Do I Start? I'm Michelle, I'm with Donor Concierge. And I've got Gloria Lee and Crystal Lemke with us to talk about where do you start when you have looking for a donor. So Gloria and Crystal are both senior case managers with Donor Concierge. And why don't I just pass it over to you, Gloria? Tell us about what you do, what your specialty is.
Well, I have been with Donor Concierge for quite a few years, and I help mainly with Asian patients looking for egg donor and a surrogate.
Excellent. And Crystal, tell us about your background.
Yeah, so I have been working with Donor Concierge as a team member since last June, but I've worked with Gloria, Michelle, and Gail for probably close to 9 years now. Back before when I was managing an agency, so I've both been an egg donor. I worked at the agency level for many years, and now I am working exclusively on finding those egg donor and surrogate candidates.
Fantastic. So, you know, we titled this because Donor Egg, Where Do I Start? Because our experience is that when somebody calls us, it takes a lot to call, you know. When you go to a doctor and you've been trying, most of our clients have been had multiple IVF cycles. They've tried everything they can, and getting to that point where you've actually made the decision or the commitment to use a donor egg. That's huge. And I think one of the things that we as a team always talk about is how to listen to our clients when they call and really think about, you know, where are they in their journey? That's one of the first questions we always ask, isn't it? Like, where are you in your journey? And remembering that again, it takes a lot just to call and say, you know what, I can't use my own genetics. So, you know, where do you think they should start? Like, what's the first step when you're faced with this decision that you need to use a donor egg? Crystal, what do you think?
So you're right. We get people calling and who it's very difficult to come to terms with that. And you see people kind of grieving that throughout the whole process, and even coming to terms with using a donor egg after they've matched with the donor. So the very first step, obviously, they should be registered at a clinic. Sometimes we have clients who aren't registered with a fertility clinic or haven't had fertility testing. So if that hasn't been done yet, that's definitely where I would encourage people to start, is to go into a clinic and have those tests done. If you are registered with a clinic, I think starting with Donor Concierge is a great place to start. Even if you don't, because we have many fantastic partners. So that's kind of the next stage, is knowing where you're at in your journey, what your next step looks like. Are you using an egg donor? Or can you use your own genetic material? And do you need a gestational carrier? And having Donor Concierge help identify where, or kind of partner you with the best clinics or the best agencies, other industry professionals such as attorneys, knowing that there's going to be someone there along the way to help inform you onto your next steps, I think is really important, because most parents get a bit overwhelmed when they look at everything that they need to do.
Yeah. When you say tests, you know, what about, are you talking about sperm testing or test for the intended mother?
Yeah, both. It's important to know kind of where your fertility is. Like I said, most of our couples who come in are aware of what their next steps are because their clinic has informed them, but there's definitely some who don't know. So definitely having the sperm test, checking to see if they think that they can use your eggs, and if they don't, if they think you can carry your own. There's just so many different, each scenario is so unique. So understanding exactly what their picture looks like, so we know best how to help them.
Gloria, what about you? When you talk to clients, you know, how do you advise them where to start when they're thinking about using an egg donor? And what's your first question, for instance, when you have a consultation with someone?
I agree with Crystal. First of all, have you done any testing before? Genetic testing, which is very important for the intended father to finish before they, while they're choosing an egg donor or even before they start the whole process, because you really want to make sure there's no genetic conflicts between the intended father and the egg donor. So I think that's very important. And also, of course, sperm tested. And that's the start of the whole process.
Yeah, and I think sometimes, especially if we have two dads, for instance, having sperm testing and genetic testing is also really important. It helps us with medical decisions, or we don't make any judgment based on a donor's profile, but based on even on her genetics. We always defer back to our the fertility clinic, don't we? Especially about genetics, because I'm not a geneticist. None of us are geneticists. And it's so important
to know like where, if they are carriers for genetic mutation, it's really helpful for us to know that when we're starting our search, to know if we have to eliminate some candidates from their pool. Though, if we do have their genetic test records, and we can eliminate that on the front end. Doesn't necessarily have to be done. The chances of the donor and the intended parents being carriers for the same mutation is fairly small, but I've seen it happen. So it's nice to have those records beforehand.
Yeah, definitely. So I wanted to go over some of the common questions that we get from our clients. And I also wanted to encourage anybody who's watching the webinar to please ask questions too. We have a chat box on the side, so you can ask questions and we'll get to them, and you can ask Crystal or Gloria whatever question you want. But we do usually get a lot of standard questions when somebody calls. The first question is always, how much does egg donation cost? Who wants to choose that one? And I know it's like, how long is a piece of string?
Loaded. That's a difficult question to ask, and I always kind of pause when they ask that because there's so many variables. You could find, I've managed cycles where the donor was local to the parents in the clinic and she had a fee of $4,000, where we managed everything under $10,000. Then I've seen cycles where the agency fee is over $10,000, the donor's fee is well over $10,000. And then you have things you have to think about, like travel, local monitoring, in the legal process, psychological, genetic. Again, when I start talking about these numbers, a lot of the parents are kind of like, you just feel overwhelmed. Like, how am I supposed to figure all of this out? And that's kind of the key part, is we help match you with an agency, and they manage all of that for you. While we can go over the ranges, I mean, I typically on average, I'd say 25 to 35,000 is what I see the donor program, total program costs. So that is insurance, that's travel, that's local monitoring, donor fee, agency fee. But if there's definitely people on the outskirts of that, and when we're doing our search, oftentimes we'll go through your top candidates and say, okay, and we can go into our process more later, I guess, but in our top candidates, I could say your top choice has a total program cost of $27,000. Here's the agency's program policies, their refund policy. Your second choice has total program costs of $45,000. So I think it's really helpful for parents who are working with us when they see all of that broken down, and knowing these aren't really comparing apples to apples. We can kind of help make sense of that, because there's quite a bit that goes into it, just aside from the donor compensation and agency compensation.
Gloria, what are you seeing in terms of, agency fees, donor compensation fees? Because it does vary generally, doesn't it?
Yeah, especially for Asian, if intended parents are looking for Asian egg donors, because Asian egg donor is, very high demand. So typically Asian egg donor will ask more compensations compared with Caucasian candidates. But most of the time, I think the agency fees are between probably around 6,000 to 10,000 range. And also the Asian egg donors, I would say most of them compensations should be less than 15,000. And maybe there's some, say, Harvard graduates or, very pretty previous donor, which means she's experienced donor, they may ask for more compensations, but I think most of them, they are in a very reasonable price range.
Yeah, and one of the things, you know, that's happened in this world of egg donation is that donors ask their own compensation. The agency may suggest that, you know, not every intended parent can afford a certain amount, you know, higher amounts, and this is the general range. But it is up to the donor, and it does, especially in some states, it goes into an escrow fund. So the agency has nothing to do with that's a question I hear a lot. Like, does the agency keep the fee, or are they taking a cut? I mean, Crystal, you ran an agency.
Yeah.
We know that the agencies we work with are amazing and all above board and everything's great. There's no regulation, but they're all, they all stick to a sort of code of conduct that is pretty admirable, really.
Yes, and I think if you don't, you would be identified in the industry fairly quickly if there was some practices like that. But most should have separate operating accounts and then escrow accounts. And we strongly encourage most clients to have an escrow agent, either with your attorney, or there's some really fantastic escrow companies out there that track everything, that will look at your legal agreement and pay out based on the terms of your legal agreement, so you can really know that the agency fee is separate from all those other funds you're putting on file that are supposed to go to allocated to the donor, or to her travel, or to her local monitoring.
Actually, that's a question we get a lot is, do I need an agency? Can I just go to a clinic? Can I just go to an egg bank? I mean, there's a lot of questions in there, but you know, what is the agency for? What are all these agencies doing? What's the purpose of having an agency?
So I think with agencies, it's more of, to be very honest, I think the process is less expensive and faster if you find an egg bank or go to your clinic. And oftentimes I encourage parents to go to your clinic database first. If you can find a donor in your clinic database, that will save you a considerable amount of money. The reason agencies are so popular is parents aren't finding the candidates that they're wanting at the clinic level. Most clinics don't have a very sophisticated database, and they're focusing on the medical side of things and not on the administrative coordination kind of piece of that, or like recruiting donors. So the agencies have done a great job. You're able to see more photos, you're able to get background information on her education, her personality, lots of questions like that I feel like when parents go to the clinic databases or egg banks, they're left feeling like, I have a baby photo, I have no real details on her personality. So ultimately, I think it comes down to so much of the choice has been taken away from the parents searching, that they like being able to make this decision now. They like being able to have a little bit more control in their decisions. So by seeing, you know, I'm finding somebody I make a real connection with, and it's getting me more excited about the process again, rather than just basing it off of some generic, here's her height and her color, eye color, and baby photo. Sometimes it's just not enough.
I think when I've talked to intended parents, you know, they start off thinking that with the idea in their head of who they think should be their egg donor, which is based on themselves.
Yeah.
But when they start looking at profiles, it can become very overwhelming, because they realize that we always say, you know, we can't make somebody, we can't duplicate you, you know, you're the perfect egg donor, but you're not available. So, you know, Gloria, what would you just say to somebody who is really struggling with finding somebody who is the perfect donor, or has an idea of what their perfect donor should look like? How do you talk with them about that?
Well, I want to go back to the earlier question, you know, what the value of the agency, why you want to work with a donor from the agency. I think very importantly is because the agency will educate the donor, you know, like what the egg donor process means, like what you're going to expect if you're going to be an egg donor, and how, you know, like what the cycle going to look like. Are you going to have injections? So those educate part, I think, is very important in, you know, to be able to approve a donor. or to be able to, you know, make sure the donor is aware of the whole process.
Right. Educating the
Yeah.
donor is such
I
an
do.
important thing. Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely.
So I think that's, you know, it's not like you find some girl on the street and you really like her and you ask her, hey, can you be my egg donor? And, you know, maybe she said yes at the very beginning, but she might change her mind when is, you know, the injection process. So I think that's very important
Yeah,
part of the agency, that they can educate the donor very well.
absolutely.
You know,
And
then-
help them to understand the implications of a donation. You know, the egg donors have to go through psychological evaluation. You know, most of the donor, I would say, wouldn't you agree that most of the agencies we talk to don't accept everybody onto their program? And it's not
That's
because they're
right.
not because they're not wonderful young
Yep.
women. It's because maybe they're not fully understanding what it means to be an egg donor.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. Yeah, and now go back to the question about, you
Yeah.
know, when the Indian parents ask, you know, I really want to find someone physically look like me, and we believe that's very important. But when we do the search, you know, it's not only we want to find someone who we feel like the donor can fit into your family, and also we want to find, you know, someone that we think the Indian parents will feel like maybe she will be their future daughter, or
yeah.
maybe they will like her in real life as a friend. So we think that's very important, instead of to find another copy of, you know, the Indian mother. I think that's something we want to let the Indian parents know.
Yeah, and think of each person as an individual, as you said, you know, with their own, like, what does Gail always says, you know, is she somebody who would fit into your family? Does she look like your
Right.
cousin or your,
Yeah.
you know, or does she like mountain biking and you like mountain biking? You know, it's hard to focus on just one simple thing about somebody.
Sometimes I see parents who they're drawn to what they feel they lack. They'll be like, I love this about her because I'm nothing like that, and I've always wanted to, or I wish I had that. So I do think it's interesting that the parents sometimes just gravitate someone who didn't fit their initial requirements at all. And it's sometimes just about making that connection. Some parents just have really strict kind of, I want somebody who kind of matches the hair color, eye color. That's fine. And then there's some people who just kind of gravitate or make a connection with the content in a donor's profile.
Yeah, and also I think it's a whole picture. Like when you see the detailed profile, you will see a whole picture of this individual egg donor. And then, you know, it's not from, you know, as Michelle mentioned, it's not apple to apple, but you find your apple, but you find a pear you really like, right? There's some sparkling points, and you want, you know, you want to choose her as your egg donor. And also I think that's also important for the for the egg donor agencies, that when they recruit their egg donor candidates, they really talk through the whole process and want to make sure they have all those points or questions asked to the egg donor. So which, you know, the question that's very important for the Indian parents to know. I think that's also a value of the egg donor agency.
And that's a question we get a lot, is how do agencies verify the information that the donors provide? So they often provide, if you haven't seen an egg donor profile, it's, you know, family health information, donors, her educational background, her, you know, is there any breast cancer in the family? What were her grandparents' health? What was their health like? Things like that. So do the agencies verify this information, or how do they, you know, do they take it all on trust?
So much of it is self-reported on the donor, where you have to trust the information she's providing. Some donors don't have all of that information. Now, while that's hard for parents to accept, is, well, we have to kind of accept the donor at her word. There's so much done to help evaluate that donor. There's the genetic screening, the FDA screening. They test for tobacco and marijuana. They test for so many different things to help you get a really accurate picture of kind of the health of this donor. They'll go through genetic testing, genetic reports. They'll talk to a genetic counselor, psychological evaluation. So you should be getting a very detailed report on this donor. As far as education, some agencies verify it and some do not. So if that's important to you, we would help make sure that the agency has, and if they have not, that they will verify it. And what that looks like is having the official transcript sent directly from the education or institution to maybe an attorney or to the agency, so that it's not actually coming directly from the donor. So there's definitely ways that we can verify, but there's an element of trust there that you just have to trust that information that's being reported is accurate. And that follow-up, we try to really get our parents to identify several top candidates, like here's 3 or 4 donors that I really like. And what we do there is we help facilitate that. Can we verify her information? Can we get maybe a video or more pictures on her family members, things like that, and checking on her availability? That's a big one. Donors might not all be, agencies might not all report that information the same. So when we are looking at several candidates, we go back and we confirm who's currently available, who can travel. Has she gone to Costa Rica in the last 3 months? That's going to affect our timeline. So we want to confirm all this information before the parents actually make their match. That's why we like to see kind of several candidates at the top, and then we work to verify that information.
And that was a question we had from Gail Anderson. So should I just focus on finding one donor? So when we do a search, we have our own way of presenting, we say 20 to 40 candidates. How do you narrow it down? And what if I'm looking for just that one donor and I found the perfect one? Gloria, what happens, when somebody only wants that one donor and suddenly she's not available, then what?
Well, we always encourage Indian parents to have at least, one top choice and 1 or 2 backups, just in case. Because we always tell the Indian parents, the donors at their young age, between 21 to 29 years old. Being young age, that means anything could happen to their lives. And you really don't want to be on a waiting list for a donor, or she's not currently available. You really don't want to wait for a few months, because anything could happen. She might find a new job. She might get a new boyfriend who doesn't want her to be an egg donor. So find someone who is available right away to start the cycle right away. So that's why we always recommend, even we understand how important it is to find a donor you really like, but in the real world, to find someone as your top choice and at least have 1 or 2 backups before you start the whole process.
Yeah. Would you say that's right, Crystal?
Absolutely. I can't stress that enough, is having a few top candidates and not getting too attached to them right away. So I always try to stress that they might be listed as available, but oftentimes first-time donors too, you want to make sure that they have a chance. Sometimes when they're presented with the actual match, they kind of get cold feet. So making sure that you really have a few donors there. Like Gloria said, I've seen repeat donors, 3-time repeat donors have a new boyfriend who says, I don't want you to donate anymore. So things change so quickly. So that's why you really just want to make sure that you try not really to get your heart set on one candidate.
Right. And we always say the perfect donor is the one who's available, who's willing to do this for you, and who's available and willing to travel to your clinic. So that's another question we get a lot, actually, is about, what does it mean if a donor, you look at donors from all over the US. So if my clinic's in New York, how does a donor from Seattle do the cycle? Isn't that a big commitment for her?
Most cycles are not local. You're really lucky if you're able to find a local cycle. So I see that a lot of parents will come say, oh, that's just so complicated. I want to find somebody close or in the same state. Once you're looking, if she can't drive to your clinic for appointments every day, the cost change, whether she's in New York going to California or Northern California going to Southern California, is not going to be that different. Because if she's can't drive to your clinic every day, she's going to need local monitoring, and she'll need a hotel stay for the retrieval week. That retrieval week can be 7 to 10 days. Most clinics estimate that. So having that in your mind is kind of good. The agency coordinates all that. So from the parent side, you're looking at additional cost of probably $6,000 to $8,000 if she has to travel. But that's something that the donors are aware of. And they'll list in their profile if they can't travel. And the agencies are so comfortable coordinating this. They know this. They send them out for a donor day visit where your donor's seen at your facility. She has injection training that day, FDA screens, genetic testing done. She meets with your physician. All of that is done in this 1-day clinic visit. And then she travels right back home. You wait a few weeks for those results to come back. Once everything's back, then they develop a stimulation calendar, and those appointments then take place locally for her while she's stimulating. They'll do the early morning appointments where they do the scan, the ultrasounds, they get the blood results. All that's reported right back to your clinic, so your reproductive endocrinologist can take a look, see how she's responding, and adjust her medications if needed. Then they also really like to have them for that 7 to 10 day period. A good week before the retrieval, they want to be able to monitor as she gets closer to triggering and moving forward with retrieval. Then she just travels back home, usually 24 hours after the retrieval takes place. But all of that is coordinated by the agency. The legal agreement will detail all of that. So as far as additional work for the intended parents, it's not. It is an additional expense, but the coordination aspect is pretty fluid.
And also, I think lots of intern parents think, wow, I need to pay extra for the travel cost if it's a non-local cycle. So, I always recommend intern parents, you have to see a total cost estimate on your favorite candidates. So it may seem like you need to pay extra travel cost, but you have to combine with the donor compensation, the agency fee all together to see a total cost, and then to decide which one within your budget range and which one you like the most to move forward to the next steps.
And also, we always say, we'll work with your clinic to make sure that this is medically the right donor too, because,
right.
You're putting so much effort into it. We want to help them find a donor who's going to stimulate well. And of course, that's another question is, well, what happens if she's a first-time donor? No, there's no, the physicians like to see a donor who's done it before, so they have some stimulation records to review. But there's a lot of other donors out there who have never done this before, and they're excited to do it. So how do you calm somebody's nerves about a first-time donor who doesn't have any kind of records? How do we work with people like that? Gloria?
I think lots of agencies are now open to at least get some, like a initial testing, like AMH testing done at least before the clients can put a big portion of the agency fee down to reserve the donor. So that's a huge benefit. And now we've seen more and more agencies, they start doing that. So I think that's, that's will probably going to help parents to kind of relief after they seen the AMH, at least AMH level or the follicle count, before they can move forward to put the, sign the agency agreement or put the money down.
I think that's sometimes the confusion too, is what do they have to pay before, before they actually go to cycle, before they have a confirmed calendar. As we've talked about, the agencies have done a lot of work to make this happen. Right. And a lot of people don't understand why they would have to pay. Some agencies pay, you have to pay the full agency fee. Sometimes it's a down payment, but they've already done a lot of the work. But what, how do you answer that question? Why do I have to pay, or what do I have to pay when I match?
Well, for most of the, for all the top candidates, when we help the client to do the search, we will let the intern parents know what the next step is if you want to reserve this donor, what the agency policy is. So typically, most of the agencies, if it depends on if the donor, if the donor they really like is a first-time donor, and then we will try to see if we, donor concierge, or the agency can help to order the AMH testing or not. If we can, or the agency can, that's perfect. So most of the agencies, they will require a small portion of holding fee, which is maybe $500 or $1,000, non-refundable. And on top of that is the AMH testing, which probably like $150. So by doing that, at least they know the hormone level on the donor. Then, and if everything looks good, the agency will send the AMH report back to the clinic. And once the doctor reviews that and approves her, then I think most of the parents will really feel very comfortable to move forward to the next steps.
You know, our approach is always that we look at all the agencies. We have a lot of clients who have looked at, you know, 10 agencies, or they've looked at 3 agencies, they've looked at their clinic, they're getting overwhelmed. How do you help them narrow it down? You know, what are some of the things that people are looking for, and how do you help them narrow that down? When you're, you know, we say there's around 20,000, 25,000 donors out there. Not everybody's a good fit. So what do you tell people to help to focus on? And I know it varies from family to family, so.
I think we've really listened to hear what they say is important for them, and then kind of help manage those expectations. Sometimes they'll come to us with really high academic standards, and discussing really what they're looking for with that, whether it's high testing scores or good university that they went to.
And to qualify that, a lot of the people who are doing this are, you know, highly accomplished and are looking at, I always say they're looking for a reflection of themselves when they're in their 20s, you know, so, you know, so go ahead. Well,
yeah, no, no, definitely. That's, I think we do have a lot of really impressive girls, but it's also managing those expectations of who is available right now. Because donors are beautiful and who are intelligent and who are very well rounded. Maybe they have music ability or artistic ability, or they're very athletic. Those donors will match quickly. You won't be the only one who's kind of attracted to them. So understanding really what's important. And then sometimes we have clients who have a very long list of very important qualities that they want to see. Sometimes just having them identify what those top 3 are, and then hearing them talk. I think sometimes it's those sometimes it's like intangible what you can identify with those donors, and hearing those parents talk about what's important to them. We help narrow it down, and then we go through those profiles to see if we can kind of find a connection to those candidates, because they might have a few hundred that fit the education and the hair color and the eye color. So finding out what's important to them, and then going through those in more detail to present a curated list of portfolios for them, or profiles for them.
And Gloria, you work with a lot of Asian clients. So, you know, how do you deal with the ethnic heritage question? Because heritage is important to most people, you know, if they're looking for somebody of a specific ethnic group, how many, you know, how do you manage that and talk them through the availability of certain donors, that there are, you know, for instance, Greek donors. We know there's not that many 100% Greek donors out there. There may be America's a melting pot. So you may get, you know, a donor who's half Italian, but she's also a little bit Polish and a little bit British. Or Gloria, you, as I said, with Asian clients, what do you tell them when you're looking for Asian donors?
And then we'll stick with Asian donors, because we know that's very important to them, and they want to find someone, say, 100% Chinese. And then we will focus on 100% Chinese and give them all the currently available options we can find from all the agencies, like over 100 agencies we work with. And then most of them, I mean, there's quite a lot of good options right now on the US market. So we want to do the search from all the agencies we work with and give them, you know, all the available 100% Chinese options. So that's what we do, and most of them, they will be able to find someone they really like from all the candidates.
Yeah, photos I think sometimes help. Like, for instance, I have a search going that was for an East Indian couple, and they were open. The intended mother described herself, and she sent photos, and she said, you know, I'm very fair skinned, and I am actually would be open to looking at some Pakistani, or would give me other ethnic backgrounds that were open, because sometimes that ethnicity might not match, but you might find a better physical match with a bit of different ethnic background. And if that's important, sometimes we look at family members or get pictures of family members and height or hair color, eye color for family members. And so it might not just be the donor that we're looking at, but all the members of the family, getting kind of an idea of what that gene pool looks like.
Yeah, although I think sometimes the ethnic background is the thing that is very important to a lot of people. And so I did have a client who was asking for a donor with sparkly eyes. you know, so that was the criteria. Somebody with sparkly eyes. And I thought that was wonderful because he was very open to lots of different people and he just wanted to find somebody that was healthy and happy and willing to do this. So we have a question, and so this is going to date our webinar a little bit, but we are in the middle of a pandemic. What should IPs be thinking about because of COVID-19, the whole process with travel? We're not seeing right now a lot of travel, but we're gearing up for, you know, what are the factors that they should be thinking about, frozen, fresh?
So just to really quickly is I'm actually seeing some clinics kind of coming back online. The donor process from start to finish is a minimum 2 to 3 month process. So if we started today and we started a search, maybe 2 to 3 weeks, we find a candidate and you match, the likelihood of the clinic still being shut down or travel being restricted is, I don't know this for sure, but it's low. I mean, 2 to 3 months from now, we really hope that things are up and running by then. But there's definitely things that we can be doing to keep the process moving. Right now, we're seeing a lot of flexibility with clinics as far as having kind of like a teleconference with the donor for her initial consult at the clinic level, sending over lab orders to LabCorp to get her AMH levels, or going into her local OB office or IVF clinic to have some of the screening done. The genetic kits can be sent out. You can do saliva kits. So there's so many different options to keep the process moving. And what we're finding is a lot of people are stepping up and using this downtime. If you have it, some people I hear are super busy too. So if you have this downtime, using that to find your donor and get kind of ahead so that once those restrictions are lifted, you guys are ready to go. You're ready to hit the ground running, the clinic's up and available, and you guys can start moving forward and planning for your retrieval. So we are seeing a lot of flexibility, I think, is the key with clinics to where they want to keep this process moving for you.
And also lots of agencies, their policies are being flexible as well, right? So
Yeah.
Yeah, and we also think we can look for local donors. I mean, not that, you know, as we said, that may limit your choices, but, you know, if you live in LA, for instance, or New York, if it's within driving distance, depending on what the situation is, it's very dependent on the clinic, and it is changing every day, as we know. But
yeah, so just having flexibility.
Okay, girls, what if somebody says frozen versus fresh? And we're not medical doctors, so we're not going to make that decision. Gloria?
I actually just had a consultation with my couple from Hong Kong last night and asked me exactly the same question. So I normally will ask them what their plan is. Are you planning to have one kid or, you know, more than 2 kids? Because normally frozen eggs will be sold in batches of 6 or 8. And from 6 eggs, you may or may not have enough good embryos to transfer to have more than 1 kid. So it's definitely a good option if you only want to planning to have 1 kid, but if you want to, in the future, you want to add siblings to your future child, then I think fresh egg donor cycle will be a good option because all the eggs will be yours. And most likely, you know, after the clinic properly screening the egg donor, and she should be able to produce enough number of eggs to give you enough number of embryos to start the whole process.
Crystal, would you agree?
100%. I think that there's so many factors that go into it. So if you are on a really tight timeline, or there's some situations where I say maybe we should look at frozen, and that's definitely an option. Not to make a blanket statement, but I do think that we get a lot of searches where they're looking for somebody a bit more unique. They might have something that might cause them to increase their donor compensation. And I often find that egg banks have usually set that. So I think we have more candidates available with agencies doing fresh donor cycles. But I absolutely agree, if you're looking, especially for a sibling cycle where there's a genetic connection, they have that same egg donor. Either you're going to be purchasing multiple batches of eggs, or you're running the risk of potentially not having enough eggs to do, or embryos at the end of the fertilization process to transfer more, to go through more than one transfer if you can get to one transfer. So that's the risk. I
Right. And
think
I
for
think,
parents who are
yeah.
overwhelmed with like the screening and all of that, it seems like an easier option to just purchase eggs that have already gone through that process. You know, they don't have to do
Mhm.
the screening and the legal and all of that. But I
Well, I lost Crystal a little bit there.
Yeah, and so I think what else is sometimes a lot of clinic doctors, they will recommend you, if you want to purchase frozen eggs, it's better to purchase at least 2 groups of frozen eggs in order to have enough number good embryos at the end. Then you have to compare the price of purchasing, you know, multiple groups of frozen eggs versus you choose a fresh egg donor cycle.
And
so
the
yeah,
price isn't really, once you start purchasing cohorts, you know, multiple batches, maybe the price is almost the same as having doing a fresh
Exactly.
cycle with the donor. And, you know, I think the vitrification, as we always say, the vitrification process is getting better and better. It's always a conversation with your fertility specialist, you know, about what's the best approach for you and your family, because for some people it's the best approach. We don't want to, you know, we don't want to dismiss it, but our company and our role is to help you find options. And usually the egg banks don't have as many options from what I've seen. Okay, we have another question, which is, do I need a lawyer for egg donation? Did you hear me?
I can hear you. It's a tricky question. Crystal, I know.
Or why do I need a lawyer? Maybe is
yeah.
You absolutely need an attorney for a fresh donor cycle. If you're purchasing eggs at the egg bank, or egg bank or clinic, you're usually signing an agreement. Now with fresh donor cycles, you'll want an egg donor contract, an ovum donor contract. And that contract will detail the donor compensation. It'll detail custody transfer of the eggs from the donor to you, and other details, what can happen with the embryos if you're not going to use them, or what the travel reimbursements or per diems are. There's so many details in those consults, or that contract. And it's really important for the donor to have her own representation for that contract, so that if she has questions or concerns, she can go to her representation to go through, and then the legal parties can negotiate that.
So I have had the question, well, my brother-in-law is a real estate lawyer, and he's just going to look over the contracts for me.
I strongly suggest that you have an attorney who specializes in assisted reproductive technologies in those types of contracts. I get that question a lot. There's so many details in here that are specific to this type of contract that you want to make sure that you have somebody who specializes in this type of contract. And there's so many great ones out there, and we're happy to send you referrals if you need one.
Exactly. It's a really, and they're all people who have really huge hearts. I think all the attorneys that we work with, they understand the family building process so well, you know. Okay, anonymity versus openness. I want a donor, but I want to keep it completely anonymous. What do you think about that whole anonymous donation question? And how would you answer that to your clients?
I think for most of the clients, they prefer to have anonymous cycle with their egg donors, and which most of the egg donors, they prefer to do that. But if the parents, they really want to have a more open donation, then it depends on the level of openness they want. Do they want to give the chance to their future child when they become to be 19 years old to be able to get hold of the donor? So the normally this is a question I think is better to talk to their lawyer. That's why it's important to have a lawyer during the whole process, so they can talk about how would they be able to manage the open donation between the intended parents and the egg donors.
Yeah, and we have people who ask if they could talk with the donor beforehand. They want to Skype with her, or they want to see a video. Crystal, wouldn't you say that a lot of donors are really open to that? They're open to having some contact, and it's actually kind of nice for them to know who they're donating to?
I do. I think most parents that I work with prefer to have an anonymous relationship, have their information be anonymous. I think a lot of donors are flexible to the parents' wishes. If they have a firm idea, they usually list it in their profile if they prefer to have an anonymous relationship. Now, I think donors, and I can't speak for all donors, but I think from the ones I've coordinated, they really appreciate something, even if it's just knowing a little bit about the intended parents, or they have the chance to speak to them. I think that really helps them make a connection to the cycle, when otherwise it can really start to feel like a business transaction. They're dealing with attorneys and with clinics, with so many different pieces that don't involve the human element of it. So I think bringing the parents back in, having some kind of contact can really help. I also think it's very beneficial for the parents to see that, and it really helps them connect with their donor as well.
And also, wouldn't you say though, you know, we're in an age now where a lot of people are getting genetic testing and finding out their ancestry, 23andMe. You know, I always advise people there's no such thing as anonymous. You know, there is a chance, you know, and keeping this secret for, and we leave this up to our intended parents, of course, but keeping this secret from your child can be harmful. So it's always better to be open. You don't doesn't mean you have to tell the whole world, but talking with your child from day one about their origins, you know, where they came from, how that we had somebody else to help us, you know, it takes the stigma away from it, I suppose.
Yeah, and I get that question a lot, with intended parents who will say, you know, I want to make sure, or they express some concern about making sure they remain completely anonymous, and donors as well. And donors, I'll say, you can reverse search Google image and these donors pop up. We see that all the time. And so letting donors know it's virtually impossible to keep you anonymous. And the parents, I always kind of let them know if they're not planning on telling. I say, you know, that we're in an age where you do a 23andMe kit and you get a list of your relatives online. So understanding the options that are available for people to research more about their genetics and what that means for their wishes to remain anonymous is important to understand before going into this.
Gail Anderson just made a clarification about some of the attorneys that they charge, often they'll charge a flat fee, not necessarily by the hour. So
that's another key point, because I see people who will choose an attorney who's local in their town and had a good reputation. When they have to draft one of these contracts from scratch, and they usually charge an hourly rate, and I've seen that happen in the past with just a fee schedule that is way beyond what the typical contracts cost.
What other questions? We've gone over a lot, and I'm looking at the time. We've been talking for 45 minutes. So what other questions do you think you get a lot from intended parents who are looking to do this, but, you know, aren't quite sure where to start?
I think we have covered most of the questions.
Yeah.
I think.
Well, I have a question. I have a question for you, Crystal, since you've been a donor. And why would anybody want to be an egg donor? I wouldn't do it, honestly. It's just not something that I could do. But I know a lot of young women who have done it, and I see them every day.
Yes, and there's many. I mean, when I had the agency, that's one of the questions, is what kind of brings you, and you see a range of questions from, you know, they're young, they're starting out in life. A lot of them have a lot of student debt. We talked about that, how many are ambitious and they're going to school, pursuing their bachelor's or master's degree. So they see this as a way to help someone out while they're kind of helping prepare their future, pave their path for their future. I see some donors who are like, I was an organ, or I'm registered on the bone marrow donors, and this is something like that's really I want to give back if I can because I'm not having children right now. Some people don't have any intention of having children in the future, but they still think that they have a lot to offer. I think there's kind of an emotional element to it as well, where a lot of donors just, there's something about this that is just like helping someone else out. You take the financial out of it, and that process of being selected, I've seen so many donors get really emotional when I contact them and I'm like, hey, I have a couple who's really interested in your profile, and they just are like, why? Like, what did they like? They
Oh.
want to know what they like about me. Like, what are they like? And there's really this connection there that I think that the agencies are able to see a lot of this. And maybe the parents don't get to see that. And that's one aspect that I really like to try to connect the two, because there's so much desire there to help. And I see so many like check in afterwards being like, hey, how did the transfer go? Would you let me know any updates? And we have to check in with the parents before we can share any of that information. But there's just this, I think that's the most beautiful, where the donors are really just really flattered, and they're like, that's just really touching. Like, why? What? Tell me more about them. And oftentimes we don't have that much to share. So I'll try to encourage my parents and say, if there's anything, even if it's a sentence or two, share it with them, because that really ties them to the process and kind of brings it home.
And sometimes it's nice for the parents to send a little gift afterwards, or, we talk to them about that. I think there's always this fear too going into this, that the donor might come back for the kids, that
Show up.
they don't,
I know.
I mean, they're not, are they, how does an egg donor view these eggs? Like as a future children? I mean,
yeah, I see, sometimes I see profiles that will say like, I'm not open to future contact because I'm just not sure. I haven't really kind of like processed all of that. And then some profiles who are like, that would be amazing, but this is not my child. This is, I'm someone else be parents, and that is their child. But if they have any questions about like our DNA on my side, the biological markers, like I'm happy to answer those. So I think you see quite the range. So if parents have, I always try to tell them, if you have something really specific in mind going into this, let's talk through it first. Let's see what that looks like, so that we can find you a match that matches kind of your philosophies there. We don't want to pair you up with someone if you want to have contact with them after the cycle and they want to be completely anonymous the rest of their life. That's important, just to make sure that if it's important for them, that we match them appropriately.
We actually had a question from Lynn that says the age range, and actually that brings into the idea of the age range for donors is 21 to 29, 21 being the lower end, and that's a guideline by ASRMs, because that's the age when most women are able to make that kind of decision. Sure, there's donors out there who are 18, 19, but we don't recommend that, because it's a huge decision. And I think 21 is a good age, and they do go through a lot of mental health therapy, screening, and talking with therapists. And we have a lot of people, connections, our network of fertility professionals and mental health therapists who can really, talk with people and talk with donors about that process too, because it's so important that everybody feels like they're comfortable with this going forward.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, any other questions? We talked about compensation, lawyers, the timeline. We talked a little bit about the timeline. You mentioned, 2 to 3 months.
At a minimum, I would say.
So when somebody comes to Donor Concierge, we recommend they work with us. It takes about 2 to 3 months, would you say? Does that take you 2 to 3 months to find a donor?
No. We find them pretty quick. Gloria's probably the fastest. She's pretty thorough, but I'd say it's a 2 to 3 week search is typically what that service looks like. Sometimes we're able to complete the search in a week. Gloria, what do you think? How fast do you think you can get those searches done?
Yeah, I think it depends on the how fast we can get hold of the agencies, and how fast we can finish reviewing the profiles, and if the agencies were able to get hold of their egg donors. And right now, because of the COVID-19, So a lot of our clients, they chose to start the search process at this moment. And once they narrow down their options, so timeline wise is, it depends on which clinic they work with. So if when the clinic's back to normal and they can screen the donor, and at this moment, most of the egg donor agencies, they're being flexible to allow the intended parents pay a small holding fee to hold the donor until everything back to normal, so she can start the screening process. So at this moment, I think a lot of intended parents, they want to spend the time, not being in a rush, and to review all the candidates' profiles, and then they can get ready when everything back to normal. They have their donor to go at that time.
Yeah, and a lot of what we do is finding out information. So finding out, the donor's travel. Does she have any blackout dates? Does she, oh, she's getting married at the end of the summer, so she's not going to want to travel during those dates. So it's about like distilling all the information that's out there and coming up with the best candidate for each family, I would say.
Presenting their options so they can understand kind of what each cycle would look like depending on who they decide to match with.
Okay, one final question. Is there such a thing as a perfect egg donor?
Sure.
That's a trick question.
No. There might be, well, no, there's just not. There's a combination of so many factors that make each one so unique. And I think just getting expectations set to where you might have in your head, everybody who comes to us has an idea in their head of what their donor looks like, and they're waiting for us to find that person that they're envisioning. And I'm like, I'll do my best. I can tell by what you're telling me what you're looking for. We'll be showing you who's out there right now that matches the majority of your criteria and is available, and she's interested in donating. That might not be who's kind of in your imagination, but I think the excitement really starts once you start matching. I think it can be a little stressful in the search process.
Yeah, and most importantly, I always tell the intended parents, what is most important is not like, oh my God, I find my perfect egg donor, but you have to think about if she will be able to produce enough eggs for you, from your doctor point of view, if they can approve her as an egg donor. So that's why we always encourage parents, even you find your perfect donor, you should have at least backups. You always have backups. The reason is because in case if your perfect one cannot produce enough eggs, you have your backup options to move forward.
Actually, I remembered another question, which is, what if you can't find somebody, and should I just keep looking?
No. So once you're done, so we tell people about 2 to 3 weeks to complete the search or the service for our initial service. In that time, that's the average time it takes us to complete a search of the candidates who are out there at this time. So at the very end, sometimes I'll get parents who are like, well, if I don't find anybody at the end of the 3 weeks, can I add on an additional week? There's no value in that because I've presented everybody who's out there right now.
Right. The agencies don't get new donors that quickly, do they? It takes them a time to screen them.
That's your characteristics. They'd be few and far in between.
Right.
So at that point, if you're really not finding somebody who fits that, it's not very often that happens. I'd say 95% of our clients match in that time frame that we're giving them. If we're really struggling to find that specific person, there's other search options available, but we would say give the databases time to refresh. Maybe 3-6 months before we start another search, because in that time, donors who were cycling during the last search will become available again, hopefully, and the agencies will have been recruiting since then. So there will be new donors available, but you have to give them time to refresh. So after that 3 weeks, after your initial search is done, there just isn't enough turnover to sit there and kind of keep searching every week.
And I think it's almost like a danger of thinking that if I keep searching, I'll find somebody better. I'll find somebody more perfect. And, these are wonderful people who are out there doing this. And, it may be somebody different. It might not necessarily be someone better. So we're almost out of time. Is there anything else? Any other questions we might have had in your consultations?
No, thank you for having us. It's really very fun.
We're not all together, but we can certainly, these are some of the, as I said, some of the most basic questions we get. We get lots more, so we'll do more webinars and provide more information to people. So thank you both for joining us.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
All right, thanks everybody, and give us a call. We're here to talk, so we'll send you a free ebook if you have a consultation. So give us a call, and happy Tuesday.
Tuesday. I forget what day it is. It's Tuesday.
Okay, bye.
Bye, ladies.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.